You spend barely a week in Singapore, end up being a bit less active, and just like that, Bitcoin manages to expand our roadmap even further. As discussed in the last videos, we can now see the next level that Bitcoin has reached. We'll be talking about all of this in today's video. Especially, we'll cover what's happening right now in October and the further roadmap for the fourth quarter of 2025. We'll be discussing all of this in today's video. It's definitely worth sticking around today because I've actually prepared new charts and new data for you. So we'll also see quite a bit of what's currently happening behind the scenes, meaning what's really going on chain at the moment. In my opinion, the current situation is truly the best we've ever had, with the most opportunities, but on the other hand, also with the most risks, because especially now, it's easy to make mistakes since we've officially entered the final phase. So at this point, this is not just clickbait for today's YouTube video. I am truly convinced that we are now entering the final phase. We had discussed this just 10 days ago. We have exactly one more week left. And that's exactly what has happened now. But as I said, we will talk about all of this today. Otherwise, definitely stay tuned until the end today as well. We will take a closer look at Ethereum and, of course, the altcoin market. What is my assessment here? The topic of altcoin season, the topic of buying more, or rather, how to get the absolute maximum out of it right now. That is my personal mission here on this YouTube channel. On the one hand, to prepare you as best as possible, but also, of course, to guide you over the next few days and weeks, especially now in this final phase when it is particularly important. If you enjoy this kind of content, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. And before we dive into all the charts in today's video, as I said, it's important for me to mention this again. Just a little bit of real talk at this point. I really want to prepare you perfectly here so that you don't make any structural mistakes now, and so you don't make any FOMO-driven bad decisions. Because one thing I can really tell you, and as I mentioned earlier, this is not clickbait. Now we're really entering the hot phase. So I truly believe that we're now slowly but surely seeing the last 20% of this cycle since 2022. You can see it here as well. My very first YouTube video on this channel was exactly 2 years ago. Back then, I had already shown the Bitcoin structure here. Basically, I pointed it out exactly at the bottom. And since then, or actually since 2018, I've been looking at the Bitcoin chart every single day. And one thing I can tell you at this point, just speaking from personal experience, if you really look at the whole chart, or rather the cycle itself, from a broader perspective, from a bird's eye view, then now, yes, you can officially say that the final phase is beginning. And the rule still applies. In the last 20% of a crypto cycle, 80% of the performance is achieved, and that's why it's really worth it to be here from the start. Of course, it's also my job to support you as best as I can through this phase. I will also be much more active again now. You may have noticed that the last few days have been a bit irregular, but I was also here in Singapore at this big crypto convention. Maybe you saw it from all the other YouTubers as well. I feel like I met everyone from the German-speaking community. It was definitely really cool to see everyone here, but now things will continue as usual from here on out. So let's finally jump into the video content here and take a look at Bitcoin in its current structure. Actually, it's pretty much the same as I said in the last YouTube videos. It's only a matter of time, and I'm extremely relaxed about the current structure because Bitcoin is doing exactly what it needs to do. You can probably still remember my words, and that's exactly what has happened now at this point. But now, at this point, it's of course extremely important what happens right here because obviously there's a huge resistance coming in now. We'll talk later about a specific trade setup from my side. So I've already prepared quite a bit for you here. That's why I'll come back to this later. But at this point, the current structure is still very nicely intact. What is important to me now, especially at the beginning of the video, is to first give you a bird's eye view. What is the current state of things? Now at this point, as I've already mentioned in the last videos, we're entering this final phase of the fourth quarter. It's always been like this with Bitcoin, even in the previous cycles. Here, for example, plus 400%, plus 60%, 170%, another 70%, and I could imagine something similar happening here as well. If you measure it from the current point, from the 112,000 US dollars, I think 30% is quite realistic. So we could expect prices of 150,000 US dollars or even more by the end of the year. Of course, you also have to keep an eye on what the traditional markets are doing, but things are looking more than good there as well, with one all-time high after another, and that naturally also boosts the crypto market itself. That's all for now on that topic. As for the overall cycle, we can now see another point of contact here. Of course, you shouldn't look at all of this too rigidly in terms of the individual phases, as I would say here. Of course, this is more of a general chart, but still we've seen something like this quite often. So this is very typical when a parabolic phase like this occurs. Just as I mentioned in today's video intro, it's usually the last 20% that are the strongest part of the upward movement, so to speak. Not necessarily just in nominal terms. If you look at this jump here in purely nominal terms, what happened is already quite significant, but still, this last push really triggers all the altcoins, Ethereum, etc., which we'll talk about in a moment. But in my opinion, it's very realistic, and I can easily imagine that there will be at least one more push upward here. So that would definitely be very typical. That's why you can be completely relaxed right now. One thing I can tell you, if we ever reach this point up here at 150,000 US dollars and something like this happens, then you really have to take a second look and you definitely have to ask yourself, is the cycle already over? Are we now transitioning into a bear market? So it's much, much more difficult at that point than it is right now. Right now, at the current moment, I think it's super obvious what will happen over the next few weeks. So I'm really, really, really sure about it. Of course, I also know that you sometimes have to be a bit more cautious here on YouTube when giving strong and precise analyses. Yes, many others say A could happen, but B could also happen. Here's an alternative scenario or whatever. But in my view, I really want to represent a clear standpoint and give you a clear roadmap. That's, I would say, also the purpose of my YouTube videos, to give you a clear structure to follow. And of course, at the end of the day, it's purely a game of probabilities, but I'm fairly certain that we'll get at least one more step up. You can see this chart here. It's always a step, then a push-up, another step, another push-up. It's always exactly the same, and the probability that we'll get at least one more step up is more than realistic. That's why if I, for example, draw a Fibonacci level here at this point just to get a rough reference, so basically from the 2021 bull market to the ultimate bear market bottom at 16,000 US dollars, you can see the individual Fibonacci levels going upwards, and then you can get a rough idea of what is still realistically possible, so to speak. At the moment, we are here at the 2-level Fibonacci. This is an extremely strong resistance that, of course, first has to be broken through. Obviously, this doesn't happen overnight. We'll talk about that in a moment in the trade setup, which in my opinion is the most realistic scenario at the current time. But still, as I said, as soon as this resistance is broken to the upside, we have the next price target here at 2.414. In this case, that's 147,000 US dollars. Of course, it also depends on how you draw the individual Fibonacci levels here. You could also be a bit stricter and use the weekly candle close, and in that case, it would be 140,000 US dollars. But something like this is definitely realistic, that the next step up could catapult us to 140 or 150,000 US dollars. That's the roadmap for now. This is actually confirmed, so this thesis from my side. On the one hand, we've now looked at the whole thing from a technical chart perspective, and now let's take a look at it from an on-chain perspective. So, what's happening behind the scenes? And these are real data that we can actually view here on the blockchain, and long-term holders are accumulating again. We can see very clearly here that the long-term holders, that is the wallets that have been holding Bitcoin for a very, very long time, and these are usually also the investors who have invested very large amounts of capital in Bitcoin. Here we can observe very well that now, slowly but surely, I hope you can see it despite my facecam, the next upswing is taking place. So at this point, we see once again a very clear sign that long-term investors are filling their bags again and are expecting that we can anticipate higher prices for Bitcoin. And something like this is of course a perfect sign when the long-term holders are buying, and usually in return the short-term holders are systematically shaken out. I think each of you knows this principle. We can see the whole thing here as well. For one, long-term Bitcoin holders have recently significantly reduced their selling pressure. What we can observe here is, in green, the buying pressure coming from long-term holders, and usually, of course, it's also a game of probabilities, but historically, long-term holders are almost always right. We also saw it during the summer lull of 2024. Long-term holders accumulated perfectly at the bottom prices, in this case with Bitcoin below 60,000 US dollars, and then sold at the perfect time. Here in the top areas, that's where we saw the strongest selling pressure come in. In this case, it's exactly the same game again. So, to sum it up briefly, the long-term holders have perfect timing for each of the individual steps. So basically, here they buy, here they sell, and here they buy again. So it's always exactly the same pattern that we can observe here. Now, we're slowly but surely moving back into the green zone. This means that all the selling pressure is being removed from the market, and of course that's a positive sign for Bitcoin when basically no one is willing to sell or give up their Bitcoin anymore. That's all for now on this topic. Otherwise, from an on-chain perspective, everything is still in the green zone here as well. I don't want to get too technical here or go too much into detail, but there is one thing we can definitely summarize. No matter which on-chain indicator I look at right now, we have several data points here. I've also prepared this image for you. I think all of you are familiar with this overview where all 30 on-chain indicators for Bitcoin are represented, and at the moment not a single one is giving us any indication that the cycle is over or anything like that, or that we're in an overheated zone no matter what you look at. And as I said, I don't want to go too much into detail here. Of course, you're also welcome to leave a follow for Vincent Crypto on my X account. There I go into a bit more detail. But in this YouTube video, I just want to show that the current roadmap is still very much intact. I still believe that at the very least, there will be another push upwards here, and that now is exactly the time to prepare for this scenario. Basically, for this final push in Q4. With that, I'll transition to my specific trade setup. So let's take a look at that now. What is the current situation? We can see very clearly here, just to show you right away what's going on. We can clearly see a massive resistance in this yellow box at 122 to 123,000 US dollars. That's why we also got a rejection here. We basically had a spike upwards here, but were immediately rejected, which is also very typical, especially. Yes, we have to keep that in mind. It would have been a completely different story if we had seen a chart structure like this, basically a consolidation phase right before the all-time high. Then the probability would be very high that we would shoot straight up. But what we are seeing now is that there has been this extremely strong surge in Bitcoin in a very short period of time. All of this happened within a single week, and that's why we can clearly observe that all the indicators are overheating. And something like this is definitely not a good foundation in the short term, not a good starting point to expect new all-time highs right now. Of course, it could still happen in the short term that there's another liquidity grab for all the short positions up there. But personally, I'm clearly of the opinion that something like that will happen again. So basically an interim consolidation phase, simply so that all the indicators have time to cool off again. Or let's say the other scenario is that we dip down here once more. It could be very typical for us to dip into the Fibonacci golden pocket level between 0.65 and 0.618. That's also where most of the volume is, so to speak, in the side volume profile. So we have a clear confluence there, a clear agreement. We had this high point here, we had short-term resistance, and this resistance has now become a very, very strong support. So you should definitely remember this area around 118,000 US dollars. That's where I personally will only start building new long positions again at the earliest. So I will already start preparing in advance to set new long positions here, so to speak, using limit orders. That's exactly the setup I want to go with now. This also fits quite well with the current liquidity situation. We can see here exactly at 118,000 US dollars, there are several hundred million. Especially now, here on a 3-day basis, it's already quite obvious where it stands out the most. And that's why we have a triple confluence at this point. On the one hand, we have the liquidity at 118,000 US dollars, meaning all the stop loss orders that are sitting here. Apart from that, we have the Fibonacci golden pocket level here, 0.65, 0.66, and 0.67, 0.618, and here an extremely high side volume profile, which means this area is fiercely contested. That's why, if Bitcoin attacks exactly 118,000 US dollars again, it's the perfect spot to build new long swing positions. Especially if you were able to take some profits here and are currently not in a long position, in my opinion, now is the perfect time to reposition yourself. Otherwise, of course, I'll keep you updated on the current setup in my Telegram group. So I'll be much more active there again, sharing my personal trade setups. So some people have already been able to benefit enormously from the current upswing, and you'll also get access to all the indicators there. For example, you get the Vincent liquidity profile completely free of charge under learning materials, and there you can see practically all the indicators. Vincent liquidity profile, also the Vincent momentum bands or the KVBSO. So everything is clearly listed again. As I said, I've linked it in the video description, completely free of charge. I've also explained how you can take a look. That's all for now on that topic. That's the current state of things with Bitcoin, so to speak. I'm definitely feeling bullish and positive overall. As I mentioned earlier, it's only a matter of time before the new all-time high is broken. But personally, I'm being a bit cautious right now. So basically, you could say I'm cautiously bullish because I firmly believe that after such a sprint, there needs to be a breather before the next push can even happen, since all the indicators also need some time to cool off. That's the current state of things. But of course, all of this presents enormous opportunities. Especially if a new step up happens here, I can only recommend that you definitely buy the dips. That's what I do personally. I place some limit orders in advance at lower levels so that I can keep scaling up my long position before the final breakout happens. On the next step up, that's all for now on this topic. Now let's move on to the topic of Ethereum. What's the current situation here? In the last video, I showed the exact bottom. You can take a look at it here. A week ago, you can see the white line here where I said I was absolutely convinced that this would lead to a clear V-shaped recovery. That's exactly what we've seen with Ethereum the last 3 times as well. So we can demonstrate that here once again. It's always exactly the same behavior every time. A long consolidation phase. Once again, everyone gets shaken out here. The RSI is heavily oversold, and then pretty quickly we get a V-shaped recovery leading to the next push. That's also the current situation here. We can also observe here that we're slightly overbought in this area. So now we're a bit overheated again as well. And that's why I'm being a bit more cautious here again. Especially when you look at the whole thing here in the individual Fibonacci levels, we can clearly see from swing high to swing low. We've now entered exactly into the Fibonacci golden pocket level, 0618, 065. As I said, the loyal viewers among you definitely know how the whole strategy works. And here we can also see very clearly that some resistance is coming in again. That's why I can definitely imagine that this area around 0382 on the Fibonacci level might get touched again before the next push happens. Because as I said, all the indicators on the 4-hour chart are overbought and slightly overheated. So it's exactly the same scenario with Ethereum. After such a sprint, it's now time to catch our breath here as well. Of course, something like that can also happen, obviously. But at the moment, things are looking pretty good with the current long momentum. Still, I'm cautiously bullish here as well and will try to build new positions accordingly. So of course, I'll keep you updated accordingly. You could also say, so to speak, that this Fibonacci golden pocket level is equivalent to Bitcoin at its all-time high. So Bitcoin is currently in a slightly better position. Right now, we're seeing a bit more strength coming in for Bitcoin, but that's also relatively normal. It's always like this in every upward movement. On every new step up, first Bitcoin takes off and then Ethereum follows afterwards. And you can also see this reflected in Bitcoin dominance at this point. We're currently seeing a slight increase there again. Of course, that's not particularly beneficial for the altcoins, but we have to keep in mind that it's also possible for Bitcoin to reach new all-time highs while the altcoins are pulled up as well, and yet Bitcoin dominance still rises. So that's definitely a scenario that can happen as well. But sooner or later, in my opinion, the rollover will definitely happen here as well. I've sketched out in grey roughly what I could imagine. It's quite possible that, especially with the next Bitcoin push coming up, Bitcoin will initially attract more liquidity, meaning Bitcoin dominance could rise a bit further. It could even go above 60%, that's quite possible, but then, in my view, the rollover will almost certainly take place, because historically, that's when Ethereum breaks through an extremely important resistance to the upside. It's basically the 5-year resistance, which is drawn here on a monthly basis. If Ethereum catches up to its previous cycle high here at $4,800 US, then things will move very, very quickly for Ethereum as well, and I'm sure that Ethereum will significantly outperform Bitcoin. This is also clearly noticeable in terms of its dependence on Bitcoin. In other words, Ethereum shown in relation to Bitcoin, illustrating how the individual ratios are here. And if you look at the whole thing also from the last cycle where the double top occurred here compared to the current bottom, we might have about a quarter in at this point. So basically, 25% has already been achieved, but in my opinion, Ethereum will significantly outperform Bitcoin for the remainder, at least until the end of 2025 or the beginning of 2026. So I'm also confident that we'll see more performance here. And logically, when Ethereum reaches new all-time highs, it usually acts as a catalyst for new retail investors. In other words, it attracts the general public again, and this will most likely also become noticeable with the altcoins. That's why, personally, I still believe that we will see an altcoin season. Of course, the question is whether the altcoin season will happen the same way as it did in 2020/2021. That is definitely something you can doubt. So I think this cycle is definitely different because here it's usually more about individual niches or single narratives performing and maybe not everything happening in parallel at the same time. But still, purely in terms of performance, I continue to believe that we will see some really, really strong green numbers for the altcoins, especially in the fourth quarter. That's why, personally, I'm definitely all set. Personally, I'm prepared. In theory, you could still make your last purchases now. There are some altcoin positions that are still in good ranges, for example, Injective or other altcoins. Honestly, the charts all look pretty similar. Yeah, so when I look at the individual structures, they're all still in the accumulation phases. So basically, many altcoins are in this box of the bottoming phase, even if I look at others like Casper, which I also really like, by the way. And we've been here for the last few months, so actually almost the entire year 2025, we're staying between 6 cents and in this case about 10 cents, somewhere in that range. And as long as we're still in these ranges, in my opinion, there's still an extremely good risk-reward ratio even at the current time. And that's why, as you can see here, all my trading bots are still set to long. So I'm still very bullish and positive. I won't be making any changes here either. I'm actually even considering setting up new trading bots, so opening new long positions here in the form of a trading bot, because there's a lot to gain here, especially when the market is extremely volatile with individual interim lows and highs. These are always picked up cleanly with buys and sells. We can click here on the details, and then you'll also notice here that the grid profit is always positive. This means the bot works independently of Bitcoin's performance, so quite a bit of profit is generated here as well. Here, $227 just from the grid profit, regardless of the trend P&L. And I really, really like that a lot. Especially, for example, with Psy here, I once thought to myself, should I rather buy Psy for my own portfolio, that is, for my hodl portfolio, or should I rather set up a trading bot? And in this case, if I had bought Psy for my regular hodl portfolio, I would have taken a loss of minus 5.7%. So, in other words, I would have made a loss with a normal spot position, but thanks to the trading bot, I had the opportunity to make a grid profit of 6%, which of course also benefits my investment here. So I'm definitely still very convinced by all these trading bots, but of course, I'll keep you updated about that in my Telegram group. I've even posted all the links to my personal favorites there, so everyone has the opportunity to click on all the links and basically copy my trading bot. Of course, you don't have to do that, obviously. You can also set your own parameters, but some of my viewers specifically requested that I share the direct links to the individual bots here. That's why, as I said, you're also getting a little update from my side here. As far as the trades are concerned, I'll naturally keep you updated in other ways as well, especially in my Telegram group. That's it for today's YouTube video. Of course, it was once again packed with value. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It would really help support my YouTube channel a lot, so that maybe we can reach 10,000 subscribers here in October. That would definitely be super cool. Otherwise, I want to sincerely thank you for your attention. Everything is linked in the video description. It's definitely worth checking everything out. There you'll definitely find a lot of added value, even beyond the YouTube videos. That's all for now. And otherwise, I'd say we'll see each other again in the next video.